it's almost so personal that even asking questions about it now almost seems intrusive. It almost seems like, because there's so many things that can be taken, as far as, your backstory, as far as like gossip and stuff, and people, coming to terms with everything that you've had to come to terms with. So just talk about your process and how you went about making this film, and how, like, when did you start, you came to the idea that you were going to put this on film?
I think that it didn't occur to me to begin thinking about making a film about it until about a year after the events outlined in the film had passed. And I know in that time I had friends and family say at various points, this would make a really great film, you should write a screenplay about it, or you should make a documentary about it. And to me, the actual story itself of, finding out you have a different biological father, it was obviously a huge thing in my life, but I thought, I've seen that film before, I've read that book before. It's actually a story that's been told many times, and I didn't see that there was anything particularly cinematic or original about it. But over the course of the year, everyone involved in the story was telling the story to everybody they knew, and I would hear versions coming back to me from different people that sounded totally either distorted or embellished, or things were omitted, and I realized the story was taking on this life of its own. And I think what I actually became fascinated by was how obsessed we all were with telling the story, and how the story was mutating, and how the story itself was actually changing as a result of telling it. So that's actually was the motivating force behind wanting to make a film about it.
Okay. When did you decide that you went from just trying to collect different versions of the story to actually emphasizing the fact that nobody was telling this story the same way, and some people were just flat out getting things wrong, and that you made this sort of a thesis on storytelling, the act of storytelling, the act of sort of searching for the truth? When did that element come into it, and it became not just about this incident in your life?
I think, I noticed, my dad was doing so much writing as a result of finding out this information. So he was, writing, and, as is in the film, it was this bizarre outcome of this, what could be terrible news crashing on someone, that he began to do the thing my mother had always believed in him and wanted him to do, which is to write. And it was so strange sort of seeing his response to this news and how unexpected it was, and how he was kind of realizing himself in a weird way as an artist through finding out this news. So I think that really became fascinating to me. And then knowing that Harry also, was writing his story, I had asked him to put it down, and I had ideas about what if the three of us collaborated on a book or something where we each told our version. And then the original idea for the film was this very sort of Rashomon-like structure. Harry tells his version, my dad tells his version, I tell my version. And I actually, if you can imagine, it was quite a lot more complicated in the treatment that I wrote. Then the versions were gonna play on a screen, and there would be like a whole sequence in a theater where all the subjects in the documentary were gonna be in the theater debating all the versions as people presented their film versions. And then we were actually planning on doing that, and we cut everything together of the versions, and then at some point we're like, so now we have to go shoot this huge theater sequence and actually get everybody in the same room and argue about it. And how the hell is that going to fit? It's going to be a mini-series at this point. So we ended up just sort of working with what we had.
One of the most touching things about it is the fact that this incident, ironically, was the one that got your father writing again. How important was it to you that you got something that you could collaborate on with him, and indirectly you could collaborate with your mother too, but yeah, especially just like working with your father, who it seemed like when you worked with him when you were much younger, you were annoying him most of the time, but this was something so much more personal. Tell me, was that important to you?
Yeah, I think that was the really thrilling thing about the whole process for me, and probably the reason why I kept going, because I wanted to quit making this many times. Like, all the sort of self-doubt that you hear in the film is not, it's not some kind of thing that I've put on later. Like, there were just moments in the filmmaking process where I was ready to stop, and I actually did stop for a while, and I made another film, and then I came back to it, and I think the thing that kept me going was my dad's voice, because I sort of thought, I have kind of an opportunity right now to make a film in a voice that is much more eloquent than my own, and I'll never really get that opportunity again, where I can make a film that is mine and it's what I want it to be, but it's actually with, a voice that I love, you know, and so it was through his voice and through his writing, I think, that I was motivated to keep going.
The film, it sort of starts as a memoir, and then it sort of shifts into like a mystery. But for me, the most striking section of the film is the third part, where the film sort of takes on this grander idea that stories can change the world. The idea that we can tell a story about tonight, we can tell a story, you can tell a story about me, I can tell a story about you, and the people we're telling those stories to now have a newly formed opinion of the person telling the story and the person you're telling the story about. And it's like sort of our own kind of time travel mechanism where just one little ripple effect changes everything in the world. And I just want to know if, your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with that. Like, I feel like we have this kind of essential human need to create narrative out of our lives and out of what's happened to us, and I feel like, I mean, yeah, that the act of storytelling itself does change the things you're telling stories about, but the fact that my dad and I chose to tell this story changed our relationship, which changed what the film was, and I feel like it's kind of fascinating how essential that is, and how, and I mean, I really feel that, you know, that Margaret Atwood quote at the beginning where she says, you know, when you're in the middle of the story, it isn't a story at all, it's a confusion, a dark roaring, that there's this sense that our life is completely bewildering until we can have a breath to create an arc and a story arc for it and a narrative for it. And I mean, I feel like that actually, like when I watch films sometimes, and you know, it's this experience that kind of washes over you, and that's why, you know, you look for something someone's written about it. Like you kind of need to put it in some kind of context. It's sort of about finding some kind of anchor in an anchorless world, I think.
I want to throw it to the audience in a second, but the one thing you mentioned to me this afternoon that I hadn't even considered when I first saw it was that your take on these events isn't really represented in this movie fully, or at least it's the least represented. Did you realize that as you were editing it, or did you deliberately want to leave that vague?
I think it's a combination of a selfishness on my part, which is that I don't find my version very interesting because I already know what it is, and the fact that I feel like the film is really about the cacophony of voices and perspectives and that multiple perspective and those things being equal, and the fact that I was getting to be the person in the editing room and crafting the film and deciding who was interviewed and what we were going to show and what we weren't going to show, it felt like, you know, that was what I got instead of a version, and I felt like it would be somehow unjust to, on top of that, have some kind of voice of God narration where the filmmaker themselves tells you what actually happened, because inevitably that's going to take precedence over Harry's version of events or my dad's version of events, and that felt kind of unfair. Like, to me, it wasn't going to be like a he said, she said thing. That's sort of a different film, but about, you know, how truths are found or how ephemeral they are based on a collective memory or many, many points of view kind of stumbling over each other.
What do Harry and Michael think of the film? Have they both seen it at this point?
Yeah.
What is their take on it now? Because Harry has he's very vocal at the end about why he thinks it's a bad idea. Yeah. And the funniest thing is that all the things he's the most worried about, that's the film you made, basically. Except it's done kind of brilliantly. But what do they think of the movie?
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, like, when Harry gives that monologue in the middle of the film, I remember when I was doing the interview, and I remember there was just this moment when he started to give this incredibly, I thought, very eloquent, you know, breakdown of like what art should be and how this, you know, was like potentially flying in the face of what art should be and why it was wrong, and you know, a series of events. He talks about, you know, concentric circles of people. And I remember as he was talking going like, oh my God, this is my favorite part of the movie. Like, that my favorite part of the movie is talking about why this movie isn't working. And I think at that point I totally agreed with him too, because like the whole thing was a total mess in my mind. So I was thinking, he was like, what can I cut together to make this the centerpiece of the film? And for me, it is kind of like this great moment where we talk about why it's not working. And at that point in the film, I don't think it really is working. So it kind of rescues it in some way. So I feel like, yeah, I mean, he had all these huge doubts about the film and yet gave us 3 or 4 days of his time to be interviewed for a film he wasn't sure about. And, you know, not just, you know, any human being doing that is a pretty big gesture, but the fact that he's a film producer and knows a lot about how documentaries are made and how much, you know, trust he had to sort of give or control he had to give up to do that was really amazing to me. My dad really loves the film, and it's funny though, like when he first saw it, he sent an email to his family where he was like, to his family in England, he was like, it's a really interesting film, it talks about Diane, and it's about her, and then about Sarah finding her biological father, and then towards the end of the film I appear. And I was like, you're in the whole movie, like your voice is through the whole thing. He was like, and then he saw it again, and he was like, oh yeah, like I have a pretty big part. But yeah, it's totally bizarre. So he really likes it a lot, and but he's very he said he's very uncomfortable. He told me like recently, he said, I have to be honest with you, I'm really uncomfortable with one aspect of the film, and I feel like you've made me look a lot better than I actually am. I'm not actually that kind of person, and people keep coming up to me telling me like that I'm a really great guy, and I really haven't been in my life. And I was like, no, Dad, that quality there, that's what they're responding to. Like the person who goes, I'm not so great, So I think he really loves the film, but he's like, he also doesn't understand people when they see the film going, oh my God, I can't believe you responded that way. His response is always, any of you would respond that way. And people are, no, I really wouldn't. I promise I wouldn't. And he's like, no, I think you'd be surprised if you were in that situation and had a child, you loved, that you'd be surprised what your emotional response would be. And I think that's really interesting, and maybe there's something to that people have a sort of generous quality within them that they don't necessarily know until they're in a situation like this. So.
When does the film open? Just to remind people.
It's out, I think, May 17th.
Before we throw it to the audience, as you know, Sarah, we recently lost Roger Ebert here in this town. And I just wanted to share with you some words from his 4-star review of your debut, Away with Her. Away from Her, is a heartbreaking masterpiece and has the courage to simply observe the devastation of Alzheimer's. Polley, with her camera, takes the material, finds an uncanny balance in her casting, and bathes the film in the mercy of simple truth. She emerges here as a director who is in calm command of almost impossible material. The movie says as much for her strength of character as for her skills. Anyone who could read Munro's original story and think they could make a film of it, and then make a great film, deserves a certain awe. And I think that sounds exactly what we saw here tonight.
I've read that review about 30 times, so thank you.
All right, who has a question? Just